Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Catherine Brookman, Associate Director of Knowledge Transfer and Exchange, and on behalf of Dr. Jack Callahan, Director of the Center of Research Expertise for the Prevention of Musculoskeletal Disorders, or CRE-MSD as we are more commonly known, we'd like to thank you for joining us today for this free webinar on vibration exposures in arborists. Do cut types and directions make a difference for MSD prevention? First, a few administrative details. We're grateful to the Ministry of Labor, Immigration, Training, and Skills Development for our funding, which supports the delivery of the webinars, and of course to our presenters who provide their expertise. This webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be made available to you along with the presenter slides shortly after today's webinar. Please note that the participant names will not be visible in the recording of the webinar. The format of today's webinar is as follows. The presentation will be given, after which time we will have 10 to 15 minutes for a question and answer period with our presenters. Please refrain from using the raise hand button, as we will not be monitoring this feature or any other meeting reactions. During the question and answer period, we ask that you type your questions into the chat box. The chat feature can be pulled up on your screen by selecting the chat box in the bottom of the control panel that appears near the bottom of your screen. I will relay these questions to the presenters or a similar question should we have duplicate themes. Your video is disabled and you will be muted for the entire duration of the presentation to ensure there is no background noise disruption. Should you have a pressing question or an issue such as a technology glitch, which cannot wait until the end of the presentation, please type this in the chat and we will do our best to address it right away. After the webinar, you will be sent a link to an evaluation. Please fill out this evaluation as it will assist us in the future delivery of our webinars. Thank you so much for joining us today, and if you have not already, please check out our redeveloped MSD Prevention Guideline for Ontario website at msdprevention.com. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our two presenters today, Dr. Michael Holmes and Lex Napper. Dr. Michael Holmes is an associate professor in the Department of Kinesiology at Brock University, where he holds a Canada Research Chair in Neuromuscular Mechanics and Ergonomics. The overall goal of Dr. Holmes' research program is to exploit an interdisciplinary approach that combines techniques from neurophysiology and biomechanics to identify mechanisms of fatigue, injury, and pain. By improving our understanding of injury development and progression, the Holmes Lab aims to optimize human performance at work and sport by developing recommendations to minimize the risk of injury, maximize performance, and inform safe work practices. Accompanying Dr. Holmes is Lex Napper. Lex has a Bachelor of Kinesiology and a Master's of Science degree in Kinesiology from Brock University. Supported through both CRE-MSD and the Canadian Standards Association Group, her research is focused on the physical demands associated with arboriculture industry, more specifically, the risk associated with chainsaw use and vibration exposure. She is an associate ergonomist and is currently working as an ergonomist in Southern Ontario. Thank you so much for agreeing to do this presentation today. Now over to the two of you.
Okay, thank you very much for the introduction, Catherine. I'm assuming everyone can hear me okay. Ironically, somebody just started using some vibrating hand tools outside of my office here, but hopefully you guys can't hear that audio and everything's okay. So good afternoon, everyone. As Catherine said, my name is Mike Holmes, and I'll be starting things off for us today. So I just want to say thank you all for joining us. It's really great to see so much interest in this topic. And thanks again to CRE-MSD for hosting us and for giving us the platform to present our work today. As Catherine mentioned, I'm also here with Lex, and we'll be sharing the presentation. So Lex was a graduate student in my lab at Brock last year, and this project was part of her master's thesis. So she really did do all the hard work on this project. So I'm gonna set the stage for everything today, introduce the topic a little bit, and then I'm gonna turn things over to Lex. And I guess to get us started here, I think it's important to mention that this project was a few years in the making. I do credit the Ontario chapter of the International Society of Arboriculture, or ISA, for being proactive in discussing ergonomics and workplace safety with us. And after some initial chats with the ISA, we landed on hand-arm vibration as a topic that was of interest to them and to my group. And so from there, the details of this study was developed. I'm sure it's not lost on a few people in the webinar today that arborists have quite a challenging and physically demanding occupation. Arborists are skilled workers with a knowledge in the science of arboriculture, cultivation, and management. These individuals work in a variety of different job settings, and they're responsible for various tasks such as the removal and cutting of trees and woody plants, maintenance, transplantation, and so on. Due to the underlying nature of the profession, the demands of the job truly do change on a day-to-day or a sort of a job-to-job basis. But they typically include supporting trees, breaking branches, securing cables and ropes, and stump grinding. There's been some work to suggest that every day for these workers can be very different, but it's been reported that workers typically spend about 75 to 90% of their workday in the field operating various handheld tools that cause vibration, such as chainsaws. And I'm sure many people on the webinar today will also be familiar with the term work-related musculoskeletal disorders, or WMSDs. As most of us probably know, there are a number of different risk factors that have been identified over the years to cause or to lead to WMSDs. And vibration has been one of those risk factors that have been identified over the years. So vibration has been linked with increases in musculoskeletal disorder risk. Of course, this is alongside the other risk factors like awkward postures, increased force demands, repetitive movements, and even extreme environmental considerations. So we know that independently, these risk factors are problematic, with risk increasing exponentially when in combination. And arborists, unfortunately, are at a high risk for WMSDs because their job demands typically require a combination of these risk factors, and they're really intertwined within their daily job demands. Workers in the sector are 15 times the North American average in fatalities, and they're 3 times the average for non-fatal injuries. As a result of as I mentioned, tool use is quite prevalent in this occupation. As a result, this group has increased chance of developing hand-arm vibration pathologies. So hand-arm vibrations are essentially a form of local vibration where the hand encounters a vibrating tool which produces vibration that gets transferred to the body. We're not going to get into the specifics of some of this, but there are certain vibration frequencies of tools that coincide with natural frequencies of the upper extremity and the limbs, which increases risk for people. And hand-arm vibration, or halves, have been linked with some pretty complex and devastating type injuries like carpal tunnel syndrome, hand-arm vibration syndrome, and vibration-induced white finger. So despite vibration being a strong occupational risk factor for injury, only 2 of the 13 provinces and territories in Canada, at least to our knowledge, have developed or adopted legal legislation that targets these exposures. So hand-arm vibration can cause injuries by damaging blood vessels, nerves, muscles, joints, and connective tissue through repetitive mechanical stimulation. So really what's happening here, when a person interfaces with a tool that vibrates, those accelerations and forces get transmitted to the person, and there's mechanical stress and microtrauma developed as a result. This can result in vascular microtrauma and damage, which may lead to reduced blood flow. There could be neurological problems, which result in sensory or peripheral loss, and musculoskeletal issues related to neuromuscular fatigue and tendonitis. So unfortunately, this halves are considered a progressive condition, sometimes with a slow onset, but the problem is that the disorder can be often irreversible if exposures continue for too long. So preventing exposures is definitely critical for preserving hand function. And Lex is going to talk much more about this when she gets into the details of the study and our methods. But in terms of how we quantify vibration, typically we use accelerometers. So we put accelerometers on the tool or the hand or whatever extremity you're assessing of the user, and we can quantify vibration as an acceleration metric. Now, different non-governmental organizations such as the ISO and the CSA have generated standards with the focus of increasing awareness and risk management to combat these WMSDs. Specific to hand-arm vibration, there's the ISO 5349, which was developed specifically to combat vibration-induced problems. Within this standard, they developed threshold limit values and TLVs. Some of you probably are familiar with these for some other identified risk factors as well. But TLVs essentially provide guidance for, in this case, vibration exposure within a workday before risk is elevated. So the TLV provides context for the maximum amount of vibration, in this case, a worker may be exposed to during their workday. And for this ISO standard work, most recent standards suggest that daily exposures of 5 meters per second squared. So again, you see that acceleration metric as our number for vibration. 5 meters per second squared should not be exceeded throughout an 8-hour shift. It's also important to note or to keep in mind that although these standards exist, additional factors such as forces and postures, the direction of the vibration, and even environmental factors could all contribute to actually lowering this daily exposure limit. So the ISO standards can be considered recommendations, if you will. Unfortunately, many vibrating tools still leave workers exposed as they generate vibrations that tend to be over this ISO standard or limit. So as a result of that, there are typically engineering and administrative controls that tend to be the primary focus of the prevention. Things like anti-vibration gloves, anti-vibration mechanisms on the tools themselves can be implemented to reduce vibration magnitudes. But most of these interventions still leave workers exposed as there's no clear standard in place for how much reduction is required to actually market a product as anti-vibration. So that leads us to the purpose of this work, which was to quantify vibration exposures to the distal upper extremity and active arborists while completing common tree abatement tasks. And we had 3 primary research questions, and I've put these here because Lex is going to purposely come back to these at the end of the talk. So we're going to try to specifically provide some answers to these. But our questions were, number 1, how do vibration exposures from various tree cutting tasks relate to industry safety standards? Number 2, what are the effects of vibration exposures on precision and performance metrics of the user? And finally, number 3, how do vibration exposures differ across cut types? And so with that, I'm going to turn things over to Lex, and she will tell us about the details of the study.
Okay, yeah, there we go. So to actually do the study, we did it outside at Brock, and we had 18 healthy male active arborists come all from the Niagara region. And the average years of experience for these workers was about 12.1 years. And the average age was about 36.4 years. So as well, when participants came to the shop for our data collections, we affixed two accelerometers. So we placed one on the saw's front handle, and the other one we affixed to the left hand just prior to the third knuckle. And then in addition to the two accelerometers, we also affixed participants with a 15 sensor Awinda XN system. So this allowed us to measure postural changes that would happen during the cuts. And then also we put on some surface electromyography to allow us to look at muscle activity happening during these cutting tasks. So this we did bilaterally. So we did both arms with 6 muscles on each arm. So 3 flexors and 3 extensors. For the purpose of this talk, though, we're only really going to be talking about the vibration measures, though. So in addition to these, we also use a test battery to examine various aspects, both pre and post vibration exposures. So this test battery assessed some different things like a resting tremor. So this used the same accelerometer placement as before, just on that third knuckle. And as well, we used a manual dexterity test to assess hand dexterity and things like that in precision using the Purdue pegboard test. Alongside this, we also used an electronic digital analog scale, which allowed us to measure some pain and discomfort measures participants felt pre and post cutting. And then we also used a grip strength test using a handheld dynamometer, as you can see here. So for this study, the experimental protocol first began with sensor placements, followed then by maximum voluntary contractions. So for this, we just used manual resistance. And then following this, participants performed the test batteries, as I just talked about prior. And then we familiarized them with the 4 experimental trial conditions. So this was a down cut, a bore cut, an up cut, as well as an idle and hold for 30 seconds. So we're going to show that on the next slide. But they performed 3 repetitions of each of these. And as well, we also used a Stihl MS-261 saw with an 18-inch bar length, just because this was typically the most common amongst our participant group. We also standardized our wood to just using poplar, and all of the wood was cut and brought from the same location, with the wood all being about 8 feet in length and 11 inches in diameter. And then we propped these up on a timber log or a timberjack log lifter. So these are some videos of what the different task conditions look like. So starting with the first one on the far left, we have a down cut. So essentially, for those who aren't familiar with it, the bar of the saw is just placed on top of the log, and you just make a cut through all the way in a downwards motion. And then the next one we had was a bore cut or a plunge cut. Essentially, the nose or the tip of the saw is just placed against the log, and it's hollowed out through the middle. Then we have an up cut. I'll just wait a second. So essentially, it's the opposite of a down cut. The top portion of the bar is just placed underneath the log, and you're cutting in an upwards motion. And again, they perform this one 3 times. And then finally, an idle and hold, where individuals were just instructed to stand in a neutral or comfortable posture with both hands on the saw while it vibrated for about 30 seconds. So for data analysis for the study, it was conducted through vibration analysis toolkit software, which is by NextGen Ergonomics, as well as through some custom MATLAB scripts that we developed. So the collected signals first were inputted into VATs, where they were then windowed to isolate the actual raw cutting data. So this removed any contamination of an idle period that may be happening between the cuts. And then after this, the signals were bandpass filtered using the ISO guidelines for vibration exposures and for accelerometer placements. So after this, root mean squares were taken for each axis individually, and then a sum of squares of all 3 of these axes was calculated, which allowed us to see a summed or a total vibration value. And this is kind of what we actually compared to, or we will compare later to the TLVs. So alongside this, crest factors were also calculated through the use of VATs. So this is actually the ratio of the max peak acceleration value calculated to the RMS values that we just talked about before. So this essentially, it just shows us if there's any transient or shocking characteristics that are happening during cutting tasks. Alongside this, we looked at exposure limits. So this considers every total vibration value for the reference duration of 8 hours that we pulled from that TLV limit. And then we also did, dominant frequencies, which are pulled from VATs across all 3 axes. And we used a Hanning filtering window with a 1/3 octave band graphing style. So these frequencies were all summed and averaged, and then were compared across axes. Vibration transmission was also calculated, and this was using a Butterworth filtering window with a 10 to 1000 hertz cutoff. And this was just from the standard literature. And once these data were filtered, transmissibility was then calculated as the ratio of the signal's power between the saw and the hand. And then again, these values were averaged across participants to obtain mean and standard deviations for cutting conditions as well as axes. And then it's important to note that anything above a value of 1 is essentially amplification as it passes through the body. So this is where those vibration magnitudes are exacerbated, where if they were below 1, that kind of means that they're being attenuated. So alongside these other measures, we also looked at the resting tremor data. This was inputted into a custom MATLAB script as well. Signals were bandpass filtered using a second order Butterworth filter with a 1 in 20 hertz cutoff, where instantaneous root mean squared amplitude was then calculated at 1 second windows. And then this was averaged for the middle 10 seconds. So the EVAS, or the electronic visual analog scale scores, these were recorded across 9 body regions, all the way basically essentially from the neck all the way down to the lower limb. And then these were compared both pre and post. Manual dexterity scores were also recorded and analyzed and compared both pre and post as well. So this was for the left hand, right hand, both hands together. And then we also summed the scores and then compared those both pre and post. And then we looked at grip strength scores, which essentially we took the peak value that was recorded for each hand, and then again compared these values both pre and post. So to actually assess the vibration exposures, so this is the RMS values, crest factors, and exposure limits. We did 24 individual one-way repeated measures of ANOVAs. So these were completed to evaluate the differences across the axes and the cuts. And as well, we had a test battery where we compared the 9 individual t-tests. So these, again, compared pre and post. So this was the resting tremor, pre-pegboard, and the grip strength. We also did a multiple regressions analysis to compare the effects that age, years of experience, as well as grip strength all have on the development of resting tremors after vibration exposures. And then all statistics were calculated in SPSS. Assumptions were checked and met, outliers were removed, and we used a p-value of 0.05 to determine statistical significance. So to actually get into the results of the study, starting with the left plot here, total saw vibrations were extremely high across all cutting conditions. So the highest values occurred during the bore cut, being about 9.6 meters per second squared, and being about 9.2 for both the down and the up cut. Although these saw vibrations were significantly lower during idle, if you look at that red horizontal dashed line, so going back to what Mike was talking about at the beginning of the presentation, the threshold limit values for an 8-hour shift, that's 5 meters per second squared. So across all cutting conditions as well as the idle, it was over what that limit is. And the same thing can be true when looking at the hand accelerometer, so which is the right plot here. All cutting conditions were over what the idle, or sorry, over the guideline, and they were significantly different from idle. It's important to note that although the exposures were lower than they were with the saw, the downcut vibration exposures were still extremely high, being about 9.8. So those were actually the highest values presented across both accelerometers. So when looking at the total crest factors, they were significantly higher for the downcut than the idle, but across all conditions, they were generally very high. For the hand, the crest factors were actually higher than those were of the saw, again, with significant differences happening between the bore and idle, as well as the up and idle. So talking about what we said before, again, this is really indicative of shocking and transient characteristics that are happening, more specifically at the hand accelerometer than the saw itself. So when looking at exposure limits, they were significantly higher in the idle than the other conditions. So essentially what the exposure limit is for here, it was about 5 for idle and 3 for all of the cuts. So this means that anytime that you progress with these same conditions, so essentially the magnitudes and frequencies that you're cutting at, things like that, anytime that you progress, let's say beyond this 5-year limit, that's when you're going to start really seeing those signs and symptoms of these various hand-arm vibration pathologies. So when looking at the dominant frequencies, they varied across the accelerometers, axes, and conditions, where if we start on the left plot here, the x-axis or the up and down frequencies for the bore cut, idle, and up, and everything, they were all about 194 to 175 hertz, with being much lower during idle, being about 54. They were lower during the side to side as well as the forwards and backwards, but idle stayed true around what would be about 50 hertz. And then looking at the right plot for the hands dominant frequencies, they were generally lower than they were of the saw. But the same thing is kind of found to be true. We're going to talk about this a little bit later. But these dominant frequencies really line up with the resonant frequencies that are happening at the fingers, the hands, and the forearms, which tend to really exacerbate the effects of these vibrations. So that's really important to note, and we're going to dive into that a little bit later. So when looking at transmissibility, it varied across accelerometers, axes, as well as cutting conditions, with highest transmissibility happening in the y-axis for all of the cutting conditions, and then the x-axis for the idle. Resting tremors also increased from pre to post. Although they weren't significantly different pre to post, it's still important to note because even small changes in the shaking of a hand can really, really affect somebody's life and their everyday living. And noting this, there also were no real differences between grip strength as well as manual dexterity. So getting back to our research questions, so the first one being, how do vibration exposures from various tree cutting tasks actually relate to the industry safety standards? Across all these tree cutting conditions, it significantly exceeded that threshold limit value of 5 meters per second squared, or those recommended guidelines for hand-arm vibration exposures. And in most cases, it was almost twice what the limit is for an 8-hour shift. So what are the effects of vibration exposures on both precision and performance metrics? So although the resting tremor increased slightly after exposure, it wasn't really deemed to be statistically significant. So like I said before, even small increases in hand tremors can be really detrimental to an individual and their everyday life. So it's really still important to note this. As well, there were no real significant changes in both grip strength or manual dexterity, but our conditions were very short and they were just little snippets of what an arborist would actually perform daily. So these results could have been significantly different if the trials were longer, therefore increasing the time of exposure. But the actual effects of this, we don't really know. So that's something that we kind of still are hoping to maybe get into, just to get into the real nitty gritties of what an arborist actually does during their shift. So the last one, so how do vibration exposures actually differ across cuts? So when looking at the data, cut types didn't really significantly different from one another, but they were still greater than the idle and hold. So this is really important to acknowledge because even though the saw that we chose for the study has an AV system, uh, it's the extent of what it works is a little questionable. It clearly seems to work during idle, but as soon as you start increasing the throttle and cutting, the AV system seems to no longer properly dampen the vibration in the way that it kind of needs to. So this means that maybe the cut types aren't necessarily the way to actually combat these injury risks, but instead it's more to do with the saw, and that's kind of, I think, what needs some adjusting. And as well, when actually comparing the two accelerometers, we get very different results, and they kind of seem to tell a little bit of a different story. So again, over the limit for both the hand as well as the saw accelerometers, the hand accelerometer presented higher vibration exposures during the down cut, where the saw presented higher exposures during bore cutting. So essentially, it's all about the story kind of that you're trying to tell and what you're wanting to look at, because they kind of tell completely different things. So I'm going to talk about it a little bit later, but this kind of really shows the need for standardized methodologies of the way that we're actually looking and analyzing vibration. So when looking at these outcomes further in depth, so the saw and hand vibrations, again, all experimental conditions significantly exceeded that threshold limit value during an 8-hour shift. And additionally, the saw ARMS value stayed over the TLV for longer durations than the hand. But during the various cutting tasks, exposure still remained over the TLV for between 24 to 28% of the entire cut. Yet during idle, it was about 33. So these TLVs highlight that when vibration exposures exceed the recommended limits, workers are at an increased risk for developing some WMSDs and some hand-arm vibration pathologies. So when actually looking at the CREST factors, hand values were found to be higher than the saw values. So like I said before, this is really indicative of some shocking and transient characteristics that are happening during cutting tasks. And these, again, are very closely associated with some WMSD risks. For exposure limits, the hand limits tend to range between about 4.2 and 5.24 years, and the saw being about between 3 and 5 across all conditions. So when taking a deeper dive, again, back at our participant population, the average years of experience for these workers was about 12.1 years. So this is really indicating that likely a lot of the participants that we're collecting on already are experiencing some signs and symptoms of some hand-arm vibration disorders. And when actually looking at our pain and discomfort, as well as the resting tremor prevalence, this was really found to be true. In all three axes, resting tremor increased, as well as hand and forearm pain increasing from pre to post. So this further supports the idea that vibration exposures really do lead to the development of some hand-arm vibration disorders and syndromes. When going back to the actual vibration values, hand dominant frequencies really aligned with the resonant frequencies that are occurring for the forearm, fingers, and the hands. And when this happens, the vibration effects are really amplified, which is concurrent with the transmissibility findings across cuts, specifically occurring in that Y direction. And when amplification occurs, it leaves individuals, again, at an increased risk of injury. So some other really important things to note. So the saw vibrations were significantly higher in this study than some reported idle values. This is likely due to factors like the bar length that we chose, the chain tension, fuel quality, the age of the saw, wood types. These have all been shown to influence vibration. As well, different things like the actual saw factor, aside from saw factor, sorry, is like posture, which would be the kinematics, the grip, your muscle activity, and different working operations. They can all be really associated with the differences in our work when comparing them to previous research. So to actually summarize the findings, so chainsaw vibrations during tree cutting tasks exceed the threshold limit values for vibration exposures across all cuts, where even during idle, these vibration exposures exceeded the limits, which place workers at an increased risk of developing various hand-arm vibration syndromes. So when looking at our accelerometers, the results differed across cut types. So for the hand was the down cut as the most risky with the highest exposures, and the saw showed the bore cut from a general perspective. So these cuts should technically they should be minimized whenever possible, although understandably that's not always doable with the way that the job goes. It may not be really practical. So that's where I feel like these saw modifications are likely the way to go, rather than administrative controls. Typically, I really do think that the saw tends to be the problem and is kind of where we need to work on this. Rather than at a worker level, like we can ensure that we're doing things like having proper neutral postures, controlling how hard that we're gripping the saw, things like that, to kind of reduce the vibration exposures. Changing the way that we're cutting, maybe not. I understand that they're job demands, like you can't really deviate too far from that. But the AV systems in the saw, I think, is probably the way to go to help mitigate these risks. As well, if we look at transmissibility, it was greatest during the y-axis. So this would be the medial lateral, like the side-to-side direction. It was across all of the actual cutting conditions. So for tool developers, I think that this should maybe be the focus point, not only to enhance the AV systems in this direction, but they should also work at adopting and generating some frequency blocking AV systems to actually dampen and reduce the cutting frequencies that align with these resonant frequencies or the saw frequencies directly, rather than just creating a dampening system that tries to just minimize the magnitude. I think maybe rewriting the way that we're building these AV systems to actually focus on the frequencies. So again, the findings of the study demonstrate that tree cutting chainsaws produce vibrations that exceed these values. And this is clearly an issue that we really kind of need to tackle. So to conclude, so the study found that vibration exposures in all cases really exceeded those existing limits. And as we know, prolonged exposure to these vibrations has been correlated with increases in various hand-arm vibration disorder development. So the study highlights the further need for standard development, as well as the implementation of some actual legal legislature to better protect workers. As well, we need to work on some standardized development and the way that we measure vibration and the way that we analyze it. And as well, this work presents raw vibration exposure data, which can be used to directly improve these AV system development for not only the saw alone, but other forms of PPE like gloves, things like that, which can all be used to reduce exposures altogether.
Okay, thank you, Lex. This is Mike again. I'm just gonna take over for a second to wrap things up. I just wanna mention a couple of things. In terms of the next steps for this work, if there are arborists or people on the webinar today that know companies and know arborists in general, if you could pass along this QR code to those people, that would be much appreciated on our part. We are in the process of administering a survey to arborists to try and better understand things like the physical demands of the job, the characteristics of their injuries, and really surveys of this nature can be really good tools to help guide future research projects and directions for the industry or the profession. So yeah, please share this if you can. It'd be much appreciated. I've seen that there's lots of discussion and chat happening, which we'll get to in a second, but it's funny enough that I think this is one of the questions that came up, and it's a plan for some of our next steps. We acknowledge that we used a widely popular gas-powered chainsaw for the study. More and more people are moving to electric saws. Some users have preferences in terms of if they like or dislike the electric saws that are available. But nonetheless, these are becoming more and more prevalent. So I think an important next step is to actually look at saw types and differences in vibration from gas and electric tools. And finally, we're going to be working with some partners in the future to really try to move this to a more high fidelity in the field type data collection. We did our best. Of course, we couldn't collect this data in a laboratory, so we tried to simulate things as best we could, but our equipment is portable and allows us to take vibration measures in the field. So one of the next things that we're going to do is to try to get vibration measures across a wide battery of things that happen throughout the arborist workday. And so with that, I will thank you all for attending the webinar today and for listening. Finally, again, thank you to CRE-MSD for supporting the work with a seed grant. That was very much appreciated. As I mentioned off the top, the ISA has been a great organization to work with, and they've been very supportive of the work with lots of great questions. And there's lots of future projects to do on their part. So we're going to be happy to work with them moving forward. And finally, the CSA group, Lex, was funded with a graduate scholarship through the CSA. So we really thank them for their support as well. And we will, I think we have lots of time for questions.
Thanks so much, Mike and Lex. What a very interesting and very timely presentation as I'm thinking of my husband cutting trees up at the cottage and what he shouldn't and shouldn't be doing. And some of the questions that you're going to address have got me thinking. So I'm going to start off with the first question that was typed in earlier. If idle is significant, was the vibration level tested, analyzed to produce any of the recommendations?
From my knowledge, so the recommendation, so that TOV limit, is just adopted for essentially any vibrating tool. So like it wasn't actually tested, let's say, on specifically a chainsaw. I know there's a few tools that they used when they developed it. I don't think a chainsaw was one of them. I know that there it is somewhere in the ISO guideline. It lists the tools that they kind of tested to develop these limits. But I don't think that it was used on the saw. No.
Okay. Is there any understanding of the effects with the use of a newer battery operated chainsaw? Does
So
that make a difference?
so from the literature that I've read, so it's hard because there's a lot of factors that come into play with the different saw types. Typically, the vibration exposures are less with the electric saw. Um, but there's other issues with that as well. Like a lot of people don't like, there's a weight difference. The feel is a lot different. So even when I got participant feedback, although it helps in, let's say, the vibration standpoint, there's a lot of other issues maybe with the electric saws that I don't think a lot of people like. So it still has its own cohort, but I also, from the research I've seen, it's only just below the limit. So if we go back to what Mike had talked about at the beginning of the presentation with environmental factors, postures, the actual grip strength, repetitions, all those kind of things, they all still come into play when we're figuring out, let's say, how at risk someone is for injury. So although the electric saws are, let's say, below the limit, they still have their own cohort of problems. So I don't think that that would be safe to say it would be like a fix all to the problem, if that makes sense.
I think that's a
The-
good answer. And so I just mentioned on the second to last slide there that it's something that we're going to be considering moving forward. We acknowledge that electric chainsaws are becoming more and more popular. So we definitely need to test it. We need to explore.
Mhm.
We're not really sure what the answers are. And the fact that even with our gas powered saws, we're really seeing that we really need to capture everything, right? The point of today was to show that the RMS values and magnitudes tell part of the story, but then the crest factors and the transmissibility, all of
Yeah.
those things tell different parts of the story. So we really need to dive into the electric chainsaws a little bit more.
And Mike, in terms of, some of the mitigation strategies, and Lex, changing out the chain itself, is that something that you'll look at in future, whether or not that makes a difference?
So there have been some studies actually that look at chain quality. So like let's say, for example, how sharp the teeth are, things like that. The duller and the older the saws, I guess, like mechanisms, the different parts are, increases the amount of vibrations that come off the saw. So improper maintenance is a big thing. So it's really important to, I guess, ensure the quality of the tool and making sure that those things are getting changed out. Because again, yeah, those do really affect even the fuel quality affects it. There's been studies that show as there's less fuel in the tank compared to when it's full, that also affects the amount of vibration.
This little bit of knowledge today for me is going to be very dangerous when we go up to the cottage. How did you control for the loose connection? Sorry, Mike, you go ahead before I
I
ask
was
that
just
next
gonna
question.
say, I was just gonna say that those are all, Lex hit all the right points there. And for our study, of course, it was a very acute measures. It was a small, limited number of cuts.
Mhm.
And we're pretty confident that we controlled all those variables as best as we could for the purposes of this study, knowing that they can influence the vibration outcome. So I don't think, given our setup, that we had differences in chain sharpness or the amount of fuel. We kept all of those things fairly consistent throughout the protocol.
Okay. How did you control for the loose connection between the skin and the skeleton when attempting to measure hand vibration or to compare it to the saw?
Good
So
question.
what we tried to do, so when we developed the study, we used the XN system. So there's not a lot of space here in order to put an accelerometer. So what we had done is we had put it on the XN's glove, and then I took 3M like transport tape, and I like really taped it like as secure to the hand as it can go. Like you couldn't wiggle it really. It was like so tight. So that's kind of the best that we could do, I guess, in that sense. There is a little tiny bit of space. but unfortunately hands aren't flat, so there's no like perfect way to stick that's also comfortable when you all of a sudden grip your hand. So trying to keep in mind that the participants are human beings and there's only so much that you can do. Yeah, we just really taped as much as we could.
Yeah, I think we did the best we could. So Lex she mentioned it in the methods, but we didn't talk about it today. Maybe a future webinar can discuss our kinematics and muscle activity data. But so we had sensors on the hand to capture kinematics. And so that sensor was secured with a very tight elasticy sort of glove with Velcro. And then the accelerometer was also attached to that. So we tried our best to secure it as good as we possibly could, but it's challenging for sure. The guidelines give you some recommendations about where to place the accelerometer and how to tape it down, but
Yeah.
the question is absolutely valid. There's going to be some skin artifact and movement there.
Okay, I'm not sure whether or not you can answer the next question, and it makes me think of Richard Wells' position paper on glove selection. Do you have any recommendations, or did anything come up related to hand arm exercises or stretches to reduce the long-term effects? And again, another research study for another area.
So to touch on the gloves, I had just said this to Mike the other day. Gloves are a very tricky thing. I had participants ask me this a lot. So, like Mike said in the presentation, there's no standard in place for how much vibration reduction is required to market something as anti-vibration. So, if you go to the store, even if you go to Canadian Tire, every single glove will essentially say anti-vibration. And it's questionable how much they actually work. I've tried a pair, and I mean they definitely help a little bit, but it's hard to say, let's say, which gloves work and which don't, because they all have different properties and characteristics that they kind of are focusing on. I would say gloves in this sense are maybe better than no gloves, but at the same time, it's hard to say which gloves I guess I would recommend. Mike, if you want to touch on the other part.
Yeah, there are a couple of, so basically the bottom line to that, to Lex's point, is to check really closely on the gloves you're selecting, because they can all say they reduce vibration. To actually have the stamp of approval from, there's another ISO standard on hand arm vibration for gloves. To actually get that stamp, they need to reduce vibration by a certain amount. And there's very few gloves that actually pass that stamp. There are a couple on the market. There are some Canadian companies. Impacto, I think, is one that does have some options there. So just look closely is what I would say before you rush out and purchase, because not all of these gloves should be treated equal.
Okay, and just related to exercises, did anyone ask or share with you, this is what I do, it helps?
I didn't really find too much. Normally people, I haven't found anything that I guess I would say that helps. I guess being active and using your muscles elsewhere, yeah, but like I don't know really any, I guess, let's say, exercises or anything.
Okay,
Mike, maybe you
that's
know something.
certainly a future webinar. Mike, is there anything
Yeah.
else you want to say on that?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I'm not sure how much the exercises will translate to mitigating vibration, but there are secondary consequences of the exercises. So strengthening exercises may improve your grip, of course, and your grip endurance. And grip has been shown to affect, so how hard you grasp the tools impact the transmission from the tool to the hand. And so there, I think with the appropriate strengthening techniques, if you improve your grip and endurance, you might be able to minimize the amount of transmission from the tool over time. But I don't think anything like that's really been
Yeah, I
studied
don't think
in a
so
lot of
either.
detail.
Okay, future seed grant. Um, Does the EU still have vibration levels on purchased equipment? Are you aware of that, to advise purchasers of risk prior to purchase? When you were doing your research, did that come up at all?
Hmm. The
Maybe in a lit
EU.
search.
I'm not too familiar with
Okay,
Yeah,
you. Are
no
you like?
problem.
no, not
Sometimes.
really.
Okay.
I've noticed when I developed this project, there's very, very limited research that exists. So that's why like something like the survey is really important, because even trying to find task demands and anything related to the arboricultural industry, there's nothing. So increasing the wealth of this research base is really needed.
All right, well, that was a great pitch for the survey. How did your acceleration measurements compare to the manufacturer's handbook?
Mm.
So they were all higher. But so I don't know when they put in the manufacturer's handbook, I don't know, let's say if, because we had talked about this before, Mike and I, uh, somebody even holding the saw changes the amount of vibration. So I don't know how they actually got those measurements. But as soon as you start cutting, or when you're holding it when it's idling, anything like that, instantly changes the amount of vibration coming from the saw. So they were higher. So I mean, likely when they put that out there, I don't know what cuts, if they did cutting when they produce those. I don't know. But obviously, as you can see from the results of this, like cutting really affects the amount of vibration. So
Yeah. I liken some of this to like the mileage standards on cars. It's tested under some of the ideal
yeah.
perfect conditions. Once you start adding cuts or different chain lengths and changing the chain types, it affects everything, and it affects the vibration measure. So the companies typically report the absolute best case ideal
Uh-huh.
condition scenario.
I think you already addressed the next question, but I'm going to ask it anyway for the recording. Was cutting on angles looked at in the study, or just the 3 up down bore? Seems cutting on different angles could increase vibrations compared to cutting up and down.
Yes. So we had them just try and cut the wood as parallel as they could, only because it there are studies that show it's when you cut on an angle, it does change it. It's just very hard to control to, let's say, ensure everyone is cutting on a 45-degree angle to compare across participants. So parallel was essentially the best we could do to allow controllability to look at our results and be able to connect them all. But there are studies that show as soon as the saw basically deviates from what would be parallel to any type of angle, it does affect the vibration output. Which, based on the job demands, you typically probably don't cut very parallel all the time, but
Mm-hmm.
it was the best we could do for reproducibility. So
Have you considered wildlife firefighters for the survey? They do a lot of tree cutting in their roles as well, especially out in BC.
So
uh,
I would
And I hope I said wild land, not wildlife firefighters.
I would suggest, yes, absolutely. I said arborists, but any people who are using handheld tools like
mhm,
chainsaws regularly as part of their profession, I think we're open to having those people complete the survey. The questions will be absolutely relevant to them, and there are
mhm.
questions to make sure that that gets captured in terms of what their job actually is. So I would say absolutely, please share it with those
So
folks.
Mike and Lex, looking at how do we get this knowledge from this research to the policymakers, to legislation? So the next question is, how and what are you doing with the results of this? How do we move these results forward?
So I was paired with the CSA group. So when I had talked to them when I had gone to the conference, this is like a big struggle, because the reason that it's listed as a recommendation and not legal legislature is because it's so hard to get it to that point. So I think just increasing the awareness, and I guess in also publishing and really putting all this research out there on a higher scale is probably the way to go. Because like I said before, unless like essentially it's where you can lead a horse to water but you can't make it drink. Essentially you can put all this out there, but unless someone is, let's say, forcing tool developers to actually, this is the legal legislature, like you have to follow this for AV system development, they're probably not going to do it.
Okay. I just want to mention that one of the questions related to this said, I'm assuming that the RMS values can be applied similarity to sound pressure levels in trying to quantify noise. Would you agree with that?
Sort of. There is actually more papers out there that look at sound related to chainsaw use than anything else, which is really surprising. Uh, so it can be related, but I think it's still kind of its own little standalone thing. Like you can look at the two together, but the sound and decibels and all that stuff, it's its own thing as well.
Okay. What time of the day shift were the measurements taken?
Uh,
Posture and grip strength change over the length of an 8-hour shift as fatigue sets in.
mhm.
You did talk a little bit about that. Would the effects of vibrations not increase over time?
So most of my participants came on the weekends and it was on a day they didn't work. It was really hard to schedule because they would come to on site at Brock. So because we all know the industry, the work times are crazy. Work shifts are crazy because typically a lot of the time they don't even work 8 hours. Sometimes I had participants that would work 12s up to 16, things like that. They're always on call. Most of them would come on the weekend and they'd be either like morning or mid afternoon. So it would kind of, I guess, erase any of the fatiguing effects that could be from a work day. Um, Actual personal effects may come into play, but that was the way that we kind of tried to like isolate that on its own.
Okay. This comment really was a reflection of looking at the correlation. Can one be made from MSDs when combining the vibrations from tools with the constant gripping of ropes, branches, and all other activities arborists have to do, especially when they're climbing?
Sorry, could you just repeat the
So
question
the
for a second?
question
Yeah.
is, can we make a correlation for the MSDs when combining vibrations from tools with constant gripping of ropes, branches, and all the other activities? So you
Mhm.
isolated it, but if they're also having to
Yeah.
climb and
So this is part of why we really want to do some like infield stuff, because all of those other factors really do influence. If, for example, going back to the fatigue thing, it's if we're doing that all day and we're fatiguing things like that, that's going to affect the amount of vibration. If we're, let's say, used to gripping really really hard and then we go and grab the chainsaw and we're still gripping it super super hard from other things, it's like that's again going to affect the vibration. So I think there can be a correlation made. I'm just not sure, I guess, how you would control for all of those things in order to directly look at it and see what's associated to what. Uh, but I think so, yeah.
so I'll leave you with this last comment. And just so you know, tons of accolades have been put in the chat around your presentation and the need for this research. So thank you very much. It would be very interesting to know if there's a change in the vibration exposure while in a tree suspended by a rope or climbing gear versus how these measurements were taken with the participants when their feet are on the ground.
So that was what I originally had wanted to do. Uh, Due to limitations, because it was only a master's project and I only had so much time, that's why we didn't. But that's something that I really want to look at because there is quite literally like no research out there at all for that. Like I've looked and looked and looked, it's not there. I It would obviously change things a lot, the way that you're positioned, even like because posture really affects that. So that was my original goal. This is kind of what we settled on. Yeah, I would
So
love
stay
to go look
tuned.
at that. Yeah,
Stay
Stay
tuned.
tuned.
I think
Okay.
hopefully to come.
with the help of some of the partners that we've been talking to, I think we'll be able to capture some infield data, and that's gonna get at that exact question. Yeah.
Thank you very, very much, and very impressive work. And we look forward to the next iteration and a future webinar, maybe on a bit more detail on the kinematics.
Mhm.
So thank you so much. And thank you all for joining. And please complete that survey for anyone who is in the field.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks
Yes,
a
thank
lot.
you.
Have a great afternoon.